What's up, everybody? You're listening to Under the Shell number 5 with me, Dimitar, and my so honorable co host, Wyatt Stav. And today is a good day because we've got two guests. It's Vincent and Bradley from Wyatt's community. And today we're gonna talk about all things photography, cameras, filming yourself, whatnot. Good evening, gentlemen, and actually, it's a good day for you.
For
What's
us,
up,
yeah.
Dimitar?
Okay, cool. So let's go around. Everybody knows who I am. Everybody knows Dimitar. Let's talk about you two. I want to start with Vincent. What's your background in? Well, this whole episode is dedicated to music photography and entertainment and video entertainment and photography. So let's talk about why you guys are relevant to that field. Vincent, where'd you come from?
So I started. I've always liked photography. It's always been something I've been into from the first time I ever picked up just like your little piddly point and shoot camera. In 2009, I got my first SLR, and it's just been a road of money and blood and sweat and jacked up pictures ever since. So 2009, I got my first SLR. 2012, 13, I got my first set of professional equipment, and um, I had a business for a little bit, but photography for me has always been something that relieves stress and really is just something that I enjoy doing just for myself, my own personal, I get enjoyment, I guess, and having a business and having it become work just wrecked it for me. So I quit doing that, but I still take pictures. Wildlife, birds, the moon, all kinds of stuff. So I've been taking pictures now for 11 years. I've got a Sony Alpha 7 Mark II, and I know you've seen
Nice.
Wyatt in my webcam, the big pile of lenses that sits behind me in my room, plus the Canon that I carry around, that gigantic lens, your favorite one. So
Yes, sir. It's a big ass lens. Really makes a statement when you enter a room. All right, Brad. Thank you for that, Vincent. All right, Brad. Let us know, man. Where'd you come from? How'd you get to this?
Unlike Vincent, I'm actually relatively new to the photography and videography game. I started out about, I would say, 6 months ago, and I had just I've always been in the creative field, especially with like music, and I spent probably over like a decade in the music industry just performing, doing um, live shows, and just being a frontman, and having like an eye for like just like creativity. I wanted to delve into photography this year, and I specifically I wanted to work more closely with the musicians because there was a lot of gaps that I was seeing in terms of like how you could like address photo and video specifically with musicians to bring out like the best in what they're trying to showcase. So um, unfortunately, just because of obviously with everything that's going on in the world, that kind of took a little of a turn. So right now, it's just basically I've been taking online courses, just trying to learn as much as I can with photo and video. So instead of going to like my local art college and taking like a couple year course and spending thousands of dollars, I found like a bunch of courses online that were just for like a fraction of the price and stuff that I could learn like pretty quickly. So, and really it's just been about networking, trying to shoot as much as I can and trying to develop like the skill set behind the lens. Like once everything opens back up, then I'm hoping to take those skills and actually be able to use them on the road, whether that be like touring with bands or going to shows, local shows. But ideally, like the goal is to basically get on tour with a band and basically become their personal photographer and videographer. So yeah.
Awesome, guys. So what we're gonna do is uh, both Dimitar and I are gonna sort of just switch back and forth and ask you guys some questions. And feel free, either of you, to jump in on any of these questions. We're just basically gonna go over anything that can really help the listener of this episode get a start in video and film. From a music perspective. Now, the key here to understand is that myself, I have a little bit of a background in film and photography because of wearing so many hats underneath the sort of drummer entrepreneurial position that I've kind of set up for myself with my own career. Now, having to figure out the photo and the video, alongside of also just, honing my skills as a drummer and continuing to put out content, has been a struggle unto itself, because my focus is getting out of bed and practicing the drums every day. It's not worrying about how to capture myself. But because of the climate of how the world is today, not only just social distancing from COVID, but also how entrepreneurial and how many hats somebody who's working for themselves really have to wear, you have to learn all these skills one way or another. So what I want to do is I want to frame questions that might have come into the minds of some of the listeners when approaching sort of filming or capturing their own drum set or their guitar, or whatever the case may be, whether it be a live show or whatever it is. So yeah, that's how I want to roll forward. And with that said, Dimitar, do you have a question we can ask our two guests here?
I do. So just briefly to explain myself and my, let's say, experience with cameras. Just like you, I had to learn everything from scratch by myself because I wanted to start this. I wanted to film myself. So the first few videos were just, me using my old iPhone on the stock camera application, just filming as it is. Then I figured out it's shit. So I had to start to learn this and that, ask friends. So finally I came to buy my first camera, which is a Canon M100, and alongside it I just bought a book that was something like in the lines of everything about photography, these big ass books. So pretty much I learned the fundamentals, and I'm still very 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 amateur in that field. So some of the questions that come to my mind are gonna be topics that I already know, and some will be genuinely me asking how to figure this out. So with that said, my first question would be for our listeners, do you actually need expensive camera, and how low can you get in order to be able to shoot like decent full HD videos for YouTube, like not on a film grade or anything, but just to be able to upload to YouTube and not be like 360 or 480 or whatever? So how low can you get?
So I think most of the cameras that you can get these days bottom out around 24 megapixels. There may be a few lower than that, but from what I see, it's all around 24.3. And then moving up into 36, and now we're getting up into like 50 and 60 megapixels. The thing with like 4K is only 4,000 pixels on the longest side. So when you're looking at a 24 megapixel camera, you're already 6,000 pixels on the longest side, 4,000 pixels vertically. Regular 1080p HD is only 2 megapixels altogether. So even just basically any quality SLR mirrorless camera is going to be able to capture frames in video at a high enough resolution that you shouldn't have a problem.
Yeah, so basically
YouTube and HD.
Use whatever you have, or if you have to buy anything, just buy something secondhand, or just buy something so you can start. Don't wait for the big gear, right?
I'd like to take this to less of an abstract place. Between Brad and Vincent, we'll start with Vincent because you were already talking. Can you give me, if possible, if not, if you have no education in the matter, no worries, we can talk about something else for sure. But if off the top of your head, can you possibly give me 1 to 2 recommendations for a artist who wants to start uploading to YouTube, but doesn't want to spend a ton of money on a camera?
Yeah. So of course I'm gonna go to Sony, because Sony is the number one producer of mirrorless cameras, and a mirrorless camera means that when you take the lens off, there's not a mirror box with a mirror that moves up and down, which is the more traditional, old school type of SLR that I don't know your age range of your listeners, but older listeners probably are more familiar with. So mirrorless is the way the world's going. The mirror boxes are going away. There's so many benefits that come along with that, but that's not what we're going to talk about. So when we're looking at mirrorless cameras, the the brand I would recommend is Sony. And then within Sony's portfolio of mirrorless cameras, for someone just starting out that wants to video themselves, be able to take pictures of their equipment, things like that. Right now, I'm just scrolling through their website. They have decent cameras as low as $449 US. The Alpha 6000 is probably one that's really it's been really well regarded over the years. It's a 24.3 megapixel sensor, and then if you want to step up from there, I would suggest moving into the A7 range, which is where I am with an A7 Mark II. That camera right now is running 900 US, and you're looking at, again, 24 megapixels, but it's a full frame sensor. And what that means is that the sensor itself that actually captures the light is the same size as a frame of traditional film. And that's important because in a studio environment where there may not be, like Dimitar's videos are a great example of this, because he has more mood lighting than even lighting. Like, he has his lighting set up in a very specific way.
It's more dramatic.
Right. So a full frame sensor with 24 megapixels compared to the other sensor formats, the other common one being APS-C, with the same size, same number of pixels, the individual actual pixels on the sensor are going to be larger in that full frame sensor. So those pixels are more sensitive to light naturally, meaning you can use a lower sensitivity level and you have less noise in your final video or image. So full frame is definitely the place to go. And honestly, for $900 US, I mean, that's a steal. And this one, again, 24 megapixels. It's got 4K video, the whole 9 yards. So that would be my personal recommendation, would be to start there with that. And another good thing about Sony is Sony has a long history of both film and photography. They actually acquired Konica Minolta's equipment. Konica Minolta goes all the way back to 1985. Sony's been in the film industry for forever. So they built their mirrorless cameras with video and photography in mind. So they have a huge range of microphones and different types of on-camera lighting, and they actually sell some lenses that are designed specifically with video in mind, as opposed to being video and photography or just intended for photography. So Alpha 7 Mark II is my recommendation, hands down.
All right, perfect. So now I want to turn the question over to you, Brad. Now I'm going to phrase it a little bit different for you, because obviously we have a bit of a contrast between the two guests here, where one is newer to this field, whereas the other, and then the other on contrast, being Vincent, you definitely have more of a background. You've been doing this longer. But it's great. We get two perspectives. And the perspective I'd like to ask out of you, Brad, is the question that we're talking about, like what should I start with? What's the entry level that makes the most sense to get the highest quality, best return, and is a good place to start on a good place to start your stepping stones, sort of thing. You were just recently in these shoes, so I'd like to talk about what cameras and equipment you decided to go with stepping into the field, and why those options, why they appealed to you.
Yeah, for sure. So just real quick, can you guys hear me okay? It seems that I'm having some issues with my mic.
Yeah, it's fine.
Awesome. So
it's perfect. Yeah, you're
wicked. Sweet. Okay, so what I would say, and just like, what you're just saying with me just starting out in this field, I, for a while, like I'm kind of an indecisive guy, and I really didn't know what to choose. Like, I was doing all this research, and one, I definitely got to side with Vincent, because that was the one thing I kept on coming back to, which was Sony, especially because I wanted to get into video. Now, I mean, we could have some differing opinions on this. I was told it would be Sony, and then Canon is like not necessarily a step down, but Sony's obviously a little bit more pricey, especially if you're going on the video side of things. Now, and what I ended up actually siding with was the Canon M50. So it's a mirrorless camera, and to be honest, I'm pretty happy with it. and the reason why I chose the M50 was because it came with all the features that I was looking for. Some of them, like, I wasn't getting every single thing, but at the same time I was sticking within my budget range, and that's the thing. Like, you have to stick within your budget range, um, and but on the same token of that, um, if you like when I mentioned the budget range thing, I would I would say that if you can go the extra mile and, say, for example, like, future proof yourself and get something that's a little bit more higher quality down the road, then I would certainly do that, rather than having to. It's like you guys like always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. So, um, but one of the main things I would say to anybody is just go to your local camera shop, and just start asking questions if you don't really know where to start. So, sure, you can go online and look at, say, like, YouTube reviews or online reviews, and just really do your research. And that's how I kind of started out. And then once I kind of gathered all the information I needed to know about, okay, what's like the basics that I need for a camera, for photo and video, then I took that information, went to my local camera shop, and then started consulting different people about it. So, just getting, like, basically a second opinion from the professionals. So it's not necessarily like I'm going online and just not being able to ask questions to these, like, people that are doing online reviews, but getting to speak to somebody in person. I feel like, for me, being an indecisive person, if you are that type of person, it really helps filter down, like, the decisions that you're going to make. So I found that, for me, like, really, really important. So, but I would definitely say, like, if I were to do it over again, I would go with Sony, just because the video quality is there. Like, they're top tier when it comes to that. So that's, in my opinion, that's what I would do, is definitely do your research, figure it out, what is it that you want to do, and then basically go from there. So depending on what you want to shoot, like, if you wanted to get into photo or video, like, both cameras are going to have different benefits to them. So it really comes down to, like, what is it that you're trying to create, what is it that you're trying to do.
Cool. So let's talk about the what then, because that's kind of where I think your answer is kind of taken me, and I'm really curious myself. Now, both of you guys are familiar with what I do, and what Dimitar does is just a version of what I'm already doing. So we both are from the same world, as you two are both from similar worlds as well. With your familiarity into the demands that I put on my cameras, which is the types of videos that I create for my channel that both of you are aware of, and the types of sort of photos that I need to take for my own social medias and for whatever sort of work that my content creation demands of me. When I'm creating this content and I go to the store and I'm talking to camera guy so and so, what are the things that I ask him? What should I be wary of? Whether it be the resolutions or certain lenses or frame FPS, frames per second. Like, what are the things that the average content creator in music should concern themselves with, in your opinion, when purchasing a upgrade or purchasing their first entry-level camera?
So for me, what Brad said about doing research that's absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, when you go to the store and you're looking at the cameras in person, and you have the salespeople there, their first objective is to sell you something, and that something may or may not be best for you. For them, it's whatever's going to get them that sale. So looking at the stuff online and kind of having an idea of what you want and what you're interested in and what your goals are when you walk into the building helps give you some confidence in having that conversation in the first place. Second thing, Brad also spoke to this a little bit, but the second thing is to go to when you're at the store, handle the cameras. There is no point in buying a camera that is uncomfortable, because you will never use it. So pick up what's there, play with it a little bit, see if you like the button placement, where all the dials are, if it's comfortable to hold in your hand. And then once you're kind of settling on what brand and what model you're interested in, talk to the salesperson about what kind of specs it has, resolutions, what kind of video it can do, most of which you should probably already know just from doing your research, which I guess really kind of circles back around to say, by the time you get to the store, there's really not much you shouldn't already know.
Okay,
then,
all right.
as far as your question about lenses and things like that, the thing there is that it's important to learn what all the numbers and values on a lens mean, because if you don't have a basic understanding of that, when you get to the store and you're looking at the lenses, you see those ones, you've seen the one that I like to brag about on camera. That lens was almost $2,500, and I bought it because it's for a specific reason, because it helps me achieve a specific goal. And when you go into a store and you see those lenses in the case and you see the price tags on them, and the only differentiating factor to someone who doesn't know any better is how big they are, what color they are, and all the numbers that are written on them. And if you don't know, those numbers don't mean anything, and it's very easy to feel like you need to buy something that you don't. And it's also very easy for someone to sell you something that you don't really need. And that's one of the pitfalls I ran into when I was starting out, was I was buying lenses. And you've talked about this too, Wyatt, with your drum set, with the cymbals. You start buying things because you think, oh, I could do this with this, and you end up with a bunch of stuff, and then you end up getting rid of a bunch of it because you don't really need it, and it doesn't meet your goals. So I'm not sure I've really said anything that's really useful, but
Oh, you did.
Research is definitely the most important part of the buying process. And when you're talking about the camera brand, what I'm trying to get at is that you need to look at the ecosystem. Like, I think one of the issues, and I hate to say this to you guys because you guys all have Canon EM series cameras.
Yeah.
One of the issues with that particular camera is that Canon rolled out the M series cameras and a few lenses, and then it looks like, from what I can tell, they're devoting all their resources to their R series cameras. So for you guys, when you're down the road, if you try to expand what you have, you're going to start running into roadblocks, and you're eventually going to have to not only replace your lenses but your camera. The same thing happened to me 2 years ago. Sony had the A mount, which they purchased from Minolta, and it kind of ran its course. It goes all the way back to 1985. It ran its course. They developed the E mount, and it became clear quickly that was where they were going to go. So I held that as long as I could, but I'm right now in the process of replacing all of my camera lenses with their E mount equivalents. So when I talk about the ecosystem, you've got to look at what a manufacturer has available, both from a camera body perspective and what lenses and accessories they have available. And one of the things that you can do is, when you go to their website, if you see, like Canon, if you look at their M series stuff, their EOS M line, you don't see anything marked as new. When you go to the EOS R, there's a bunch of new tags on stuff. Same thing with Sony. When you look at A mount lenses, nothing new. When you go to E mount lenses, new. And that tells you right there where they're devoting their resources. So before you commit to buying something, you need to evaluate, okay, if I buy this, and is it going to be something that serves me well, like Brad said, future-proof? Is it going to be something that serves me well down the line that I can keep and be invested in for a while? So that's that. I don't know if that was useful, but I hope I kind of answered the question.
It was actually pretty useful, bro.
Yeah, man. It's funny because what you were saying, Vincent, about the expanding in the lenses and the camera and the manufacturer. Like, for me, that was something I didn't fully consider when I got the mirrorless, and after I realized, I was like, oh shit, there's all these other lenses I want to get, but I don't have the say the specific mounts, or the lens won't mount onto my specific body. So for example, I ended up getting a 24-70 lens, and unfortunately, because it's meant for a SLR, and I ended up having to get a mount. Now down the road, I'm thinking, okay, well, at some point I'm going to have to get something that's going to my body is going to match all my lenses. So that's something that's so important, because again, what you were saying, how you kind of made that, not mistake, but just that, it was something you do really consider, but now however many years down the road, and you're having to kind of rebuild your lens kit and body and whatnot. So that's something that's for me, that was something I would definitely consider in the future. So and then also like what you're saying about the salespeople and trying to sell you something, like it's very very true. And there's a lot of times, and like I went to a couple different camera stores, and when you know that if you have the knowledge of just like a basic understanding of what it is that you want and like specs and whatnot and what all the numbers and stuff mean, in my case, when I was consulting different salespeople about certain products, and I would hear one thing, they would tell me one thing, but it's like I've heard multiple different other things like online that were kind of contradicting. And when you question them, you might get like different answers. So it's like, it turns out that it's like, well, these people are just, some of them might be like they're going off of commission. So it's important that like you're getting what it is that you truly need, and it's not just somebody that's like make sure that the person is trying to help you out and you know your stuff, versus going in there kind of blindsided, because you could walk out and realize a couple months down the road that's like, oh damn, like I wish I did more research, or I wish I'd gotten this X, Y, or Z, right? So
Okay. Oh, sorry.
no, that's okay. It's just a couple other things, but it's nothing. It was just from my experiences and what Vincent already mentioned. So like just like playing with like the models and talking about the specs with the salesperson, figure out what is it that you want to shoot, like tight shots, wide shots, like depending on what you buy, like it's gonna produce like a different like effect on like your like either your image or your video. So if you don't know what it is that you're buying, like you're going in blindsided, it's not really going to help your case. You need to know what it is that you're exactly trying to shoot. So
Okay, so to take this even a step further, now the next thing I want to talk about, I want to preface by stating, keep in mind that the audience that's listening to you, myself included, we have almost no background when it comes to photography, video, and the terms associated with both of those fields. Okay, so my question is, those terms specifically, I'd love for the two of you, maybe we can start with you, Brad. I'd love for you to break down some of the terms that your average content creator should familiarize themselves with and what they mean. I guess examples of that would be things like, what is white balance, aperture, what's FPS, what does that mean, where does that come into play, and then anything else you can think of, just as a I guess just as a translation for someone at home looking to go to the store. What would you tell them those terms mean? Go ahead.
So I would probably pass this one. Like, I know the generalizations of this stuff, but I would pass this off to Vincent.
Sure.
To start off with.
Cool.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right, so if we're looking at like a camera lens, for example, the most important thing on a camera lens is the aperture and the focal length. And like Brad said, focal length determines what that lens is able to zoom in, or the angle of view you're going to get out of it. So knowing what you want to shoot is important, because especially once you get to really large or really small focal lengths, lenses get really expensive really quickly. So for you guys, for YouTube content creators with studios, things like that, y'all are going to be at the small end of the focal length range. And the focal length is represented on the camera lens with a number measured in millimeters. So it ranges anywhere from 4 millimeters to 800 millimeters, depending on the lens. The smaller that number, the wider the field of view, and the more quote-unquote zoomed out that lens is. You'll also see lenses that will say, and Brad mentioned this, it'll say something like 24 to 70 millimeters. That means the lens can actually zoom. So it has a ring, you turn the ring, at its furthest zoom, at its most zoomed out, it's 24 millimeters. At its most zoomed in, it's 70. So as you zoom in and out, you're changing the angle of view from wider to narrower, which changes your frame from more open to more tight. So that's super important to know. The other thing is the aperture value, and the aperture value on the lens determines how much light that lens is able to get in. So if you could take apart a camera lens and look at the inside, there is an iris made of little metal blades that can open and close, makes a circle on the inside and expands and contracts, just like the iris in your eye. And the values on the lens are measured in what they call f-stops. So you'll see f/ and then a number. And the smaller that number, the more light the lens lets in. The larger the number, the less light it lets in. So for most entry-level cameras or entry-level lenses, if you go to the store and you buy what we call like a camera kit, which is a body plus a lens, the lens that's usually bundled with the camera body will have something like 3.5 to 5.6 for its aperture. The numbers themselves are not super important. It's the value that number represents, whether it's big or small. What it actually means is some complicated math shit that determines how big the actual circle is inside the lens relative to the focus. It's, whatever. The important thing is small and large. So for you guys in a studio, like Dimitar Studio is a good example because he has the dramatic type lighting. It's dark and moody. For him, a lens with a larger aperture, which is a smaller f number, is going to be more beneficial because he needs a lens that lets in plenty of light because he has less light available in his studio. For you, Wyatt, your studio is super well lit. You have your lights in front of your computer, and in your drum room you have your tower lights and stuff in there. So for you, something like f4, f5.6 it's not gonna matter as much as it would for Dimitar. The reason that all these values are important is because aperture, sensor sensitivity, and shutter speed are all linked together. It's the exposure triangle. So anytime you change one, you have to change the other two. And whether you do it manually or your camera does it for you, it doesn't matter. The point is changing one will change the other two. So when we talk about a dimmer lighting situation, like in Dimitar's studio, if he has a lens that is f4 at its maximum, then either his shutter speed is going to be slower or his sensor sensitivity is going to be higher. Slower shutter speed can cause his movements around the drum kit to blur, and higher sensitivity will generate noise in his videos and make them look grainy. So like something like an f2.8 lens lets in twice as much light as an f4. I know that doesn't make any sense because 2.8 isn't half of 4. That goes back to the f number and the math. But that would allow him for the same shutter speed and sensitivity to let in more light. So he could use like at f4, say he's at 1/125th of a second on his shutter speed and 400 on his ISO. Okay, well, if I put the aperture now at 2.8, I can keep that 1/25th, 1/125th, but I can cut my ISO in half down to 200, so less noise for the same shutter speed.
Yeah, you're totally right. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're fine. I was going to say you can go off into like the weeds and really like sit there and analyze all these things, but that's the important parts of a lens: the focal length and the aperture value. And you'll find, like I said about the focal length, the smaller the focal length or the bigger, when you get to those extremes, it gets really expensive. Same thing with apertures. As the aperture gets bigger, as you get to smaller and smaller f numbers, the price of the lens will go up. You'll also find on the really expensive lenses that the aperture will be constant, meaning it won't be a range like 3.5 to 5.6. It'll just say, like on Brad's lens, it'll say 24 to 70 f4. That means no matter where you zoom it, the aperture can always be open to a maximum size of 4. And the reason the price goes up is because when you do that, if you were to do all the math that I mentioned, you would see that the end of the front element on the lens, the front piece of glass, would have to get bigger and bigger and bigger to accommodate that. Like that giant Canon of a lens that I have, the front element's 95 millimeters, which is big. And actually, it may not even be 95. Let me look real quick. It's nearby. I think it is, 95. So you find as you get the more expensive lenses, they're bigger, heavier, but they're more capable of operating in the extremes. And that's an important thing to know too, is there's no bad camera you can go out and buy today, really. And there's really not a bad lens. It's just the professional cameras, professional lenses are going to operate better and produce better image quality in those extreme situations than the entry-level type stuff. and that's something we kind of glossed over earlier, but I think it's important to mention. Uh, and then getting into the camera terms, Wyatt mentioned white balance. So white balance is super important. That determines how red, blue, green, or magenta your final output is. So if you have a digital camera, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that it tries to make everything in the frame 18% gray. So when you look at a final picture, knowing that in mind, you can use the white balance settings in your whatever program you're using, Premiere Pro, Lightroom, whatever. You can use that information to balance your photo. So if it's a little too red, you can add some blue. If it's a little, or green. If it's a little too yellow, you can add some blue. If it's a little too blue, you add yellow. If it's a little too green, you add some red. White balance, the goal is to make your whites neutral, and then the camera or whatever editing application you're using will balance all the colors off of that. And that's how you get those the natural color. Your brain and your eyes white balance for you all the time, in real time, constantly. You would never know if you walked into a room that was lit by fluorescent lights, but fluorescent lights are very green. And you can see that if you take a picture with your camera and you don't white balance for fluorescent lights, everything will come out looking green. Same thing with your standard tungsten light bulbs, incandescent light bulbs. Those are very orange and yellow. Again, you don't realize that because your brain adjusts for it on the fly, but your camera cannot unless you tell it to. So if you were to just go take a picture of that, everything would be very yellow orange, and you would need to add a lot of blue. Same thing in the shade, it's blue. I can't think of any sources that are really red off the top of my head, but white balance is super important, and that's what it means. It's balancing the whites and the neutrals in the picture so that your colors appear natural. And then I think the other one I heard Wyatt say was FPS, which is frames per second. That's super important for video. And the best way to explain that is to think about like a vinyl record, right? Everyone, all the audiophiles, and I'm sure the metalheads that are listening right now know that a vinyl record is the truest reproduction of the sound, because the actual sound wave is cut into the vinyl. So the thing with that is when we move to CDs and MP3s, we're actually sampling that sound wave, and we're taking little pieces and we're reproducing the song. Frames per second in video works the same way. So your eyes are like the vinyl record. They're taking in real time all of the information that they receive when you're moving around the world. When we're taking video, it's not possible for technology to replicate that. So your frames per second is your sampling of that real-time infinite number of frames. And the higher the frames per second, the more the smoother the video looks, the more motion you're able to capture. So taking something at 30 frames per second, and if there's any gamers listening in, they'll know this, 30 frames per second compared to 60 frames per second. We all know when we move from console to PC, you see the huge difference in the fidelity of the motion. And then from 60 to 120 up to 144, same thing. So on a camera, 24 frames per second is going to be more of your cinematic look. So if you're into that, like, you go to the movies and you watch a film on a big screen, those are usually 24 frames per second. So if that's a look that you like, 24 frames per second is the one for you. If you want the high def super smooth, then you need to shoot at 60 frames per second. And then 30 is just it's a good middle ground. Lots of people use 30 for lots and lots of stuff, but that's what those numbers mean. It's just how many frames per second you're pulling off your sensor to make up a second of video. So
may I just interrupt you for a second, because as you're currently speaking about frames per second, actually me and Wyatt have discussed this a lot of times, and you're totally right about everything you said. But I just wanted to point out, or maybe even ask, not so much to point out, since, let's say, I'm trying to get more, with all the moody lights and the way that I've set up my cameras, which are an M50, just like Bradley, and an M100, which was my first initial camera. So they're using the same the same lens. It's the Canon EFM 15 to 45. So yeah, and let's say I want to have more of a cinematic look, and so far what I've read and what I've heard in all the videos, everybody says 24 is the way to go. Even when with all the modern technology and cameras and lenses, still to this day, 24 is the way to go for cinematic look. And 30 is more of a like television or streaming and stuff, and 60 is for more gaming and maybe slow motion and stuff. So my question is it wrong to shoot in 24? And if not, do you have any recommendations for guys like me, or any general guidelines, how to choose the frame rate according to your needs and to your goals of what you want to see in the video you're going to produce?
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered your own question, I think, as you asked it. I don't think there is a right or wrong way. It's what you want. And so what you're wanting is a cinematic look, and 24 frames per second is the cinematic frame rate. I mean, so.
Okay, I have a question that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Wyatt.
I was just going to expand on what Dimitar just asked, because it got me thinking about FPS. And the only time that I ever really think, I haven't even ever, okay, let me rephrase this. The only time where I ever consider FPS personally is because I'm always 29.97, always, just default 29.97. The only time that I ever think about it is in the back of my reaction videos, and in other videos at times, but it's most obvious in the back of my reaction videos. Behind where I sit at the desk, there's a strand of lights over the archway that separates the two rooms, my bedroom and my office. That strand of lights is colored. And what you'll notice in the reaction videos is when you're watching that strand of lights, the colors are actually turning on and off and moving through the strand of lights. And it looks like I have some setting on the lights set up so that the lights will turn on and off and almost sparkle down the string of lights and then restart at the beginning of the string of lights. This isn't actually happening in real life. This is happening because of the relationship between the sample rate of the camera and the rate in which those lights are, I guess the source is creating the lights at, or however that would be described. I'm not even sure. So what's the relationship that's happening there, and why is it the case that some lights look great on camera and then other lights are almost like turning themselves off at times, or creating weird reflections on the wall, or moving around in certain ways? You guys know what I'm talking about? If you do, how do you avoid that?
I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's because they're LEDs. So the way an LED works is it uses electricity to generate light in a diode. Electricity coming out of your wall is not constant. It oscillates back and forth at a specific frequency. So in the United States, that frequency is 60 hertz, which equates to 60 frames per second. So if you were to shoot a set of LED lights at 60 frames per second, they would not flicker. The reason you're seeing them flicker is because they're flickering fast enough for your eyes to be able, your eyes don't see that. Your brain filters the flickering out. Your camera shooting at 24 frames per second is seeing them flicker because the frame rates don't exactly match. That's why. So your camera is able to see those little brief, almost unseeable moments where the light is off for that split second, where the electricity wave hits zero before it comes back up and the light turns back on. So if you didn't have LED lights right there, if they were regular incandescent lights or fluorescent lights, well, maybe even fluorescent lights, but incandescent lights for sure, they wouldn't flicker.
Let's say you were setting up a space like one similar to Dimitar's and mine. In your setting up of the space, and this question's for both of you because it's not just about what we just talked about, but I want to talk about that first and then expand into it. When setting up a space like Dimitar's or mine, so a studio space, and lighting it for videos specifically, what are some things that the content creator, Dimitar, can you, whoever that is, can they mute their mic so we don't have the clicking?
It's Vincent.
Yeah, my bad.
No worries. Where was I? Oh, right. So when setting up a studio space, what type of lights and what type of placement should you be concerned with to both light the subject appropriately and also avoid the sort of, I guess, I don't want to call it disturbance, but avoid the sort of, I guess, disruption in the light patterns that you just described with the way that the electricity actually oscillates coming out of that socket.
For me, I don't like my light sources in the frame. I like them outside of the frame, illuminating what's in the frame. If you're going to put light sources in the frame, I would say try to avoid LEDs because they're the ones that will flicker. But of course, that's become more difficult now because regular light bulbs are going away, regular lights.
Yeah.
So what were you going to say, Brad? I feel like you were going to say something and I kind of interrupted.
No, I was just basically going to kind of allude to the exact same thing that you were kind of mentioning. The LEDs, that's actually really interesting because it's something I didn't know. So I actually made note of that myself. But yeah, making sure that the lightings aren't in your frame. Like they're wherever you're filming, they're like essentially behind you. So you want it to obviously be lighting the subject or whatever you're trying to emphasize as opposed to it being in frame or even behind your subject. So that way, like, it's like, if the lighting was like behind Wyatt and I'm filming in front of him, it's going to make him look more like a silhouette instead of like illuminating him as the subject and keeping like almost like letting the viewer's attention focus solely on him. So but that's just like a basic, a kind of like a given. So but depending on what it is that you're trying to, I guess, the look that you're trying to go for, like again, like Wyatt Studios, it's super well lit, and he has lights like almost every single angle that you can imagine. But I'm not sure what Dimitar's his, like you're saying, it's more like moody. So I'm imagining it's just like a little, like it's more like dim, like it's not as well lit. It's kind of dark. And
it's darker.
Okay. Yeah. It's a black background, and the lights are under an angle, so they can emphasize their parts.
Yeah. Okay. So like in that, like if it's like more like a little bit darker looking, and this is something that Vincent was actually alluding to earlier with the f-stops and the aperture. So like if you have like a camera that's capable of having it has lower aperture, or f-stop, it's going to allow more light into the actual sensor. So you basically, if you have something that's your lens is capable of that, then it's going to come to your advantage when you're in a situation where you're capturing video that's in low light. So as opposed to, if you want to artificially bump up that light, say like cranking up your ISO, it's going to make things look more grainy. So that's something I would definitely consider.
Actually, since you touched again on the lens, I got a quick question because you said you own an M50 and I'm using M50 as well. And actually, Vincent, you can also answer this because it's more of a Canon question. But anyway, there is actually two ways. There are two ways you can use the bigger lens, like EF lenses and EFS.
I'm so sorry. Brad, can you mute your mic?
Yeah,
We can hear every keystroke.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you can actually use either an adapter, which is produced officially by Canon. So you can use either EFS or EF lens, or you can use a speed booster. And I guess you guys know a lot more than me, and you would be kind enough to explain what a speed booster is. But anyway, what do you think about it? Does it affect the quality of the image if you use, let's say, an adapter and let's say the Canon 50mm lens, which is 1.8 f-stop? And is it a good practice to use a speed booster so you can turn your crop, like mine, into, or actually to cheat it into a full frame?
Yeah, so what I ended up doing, I ended up getting a Sigma 24mm, 24 to 70. It's f1.4, and what I ended up getting to mount that onto my Canon M50 was a Viltrox speed booster, and this is like when I first this is like, yeah, going first back to when I got the camera. So I remember doing my research, and Vincent could probably talk a little bit better to this, but I remember doing the research and I sided with the Viltrox speed booster adapter. I couldn't remember exactly what it is that separated me from buying one from the other. But there's like, I think like the only thing that I've really noticed is that when I'm doing video, like if it's on autofocus, you'll hear it kind of it like adjusting and clicking and it almost sounds like a little like machine running, and you'll notice that in the playback too. It's quite loud. So that's something like you'll want to account for. But that's like really the only issues I've had with my speed booster. Other than that, like no real issues. Like it's been great. So just in terms of like, having access to that that lens, just having the mount, it's an awesome feature. So and then there was something else you had touched on, the crop factor. So that's obviously something you want to keep into account too. Again, that's something that like off the top of my head I would have to look at like the numbers and everything, but there's a crop factor that comes with that too. If you're mounting say like the lens I have onto the body that I have. So there's a little bit of math involved. It's not too complex, but I can't exactly remember how the math goes. So I don't know if Vincent wants to speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah. I'll start by saying I am incredibly anti-adapter of any kind. If it was me giving advice to someone that was looking at a speed booster, I would say save up and buy a lens with a faster aperture. For me, I don't want any extra pieces of glass that don't need to be there between my lenses and my sensor.
And just to interrupt real quick, this is the exact same philosophy that I take, and not myself, not only me, but most producers take when it comes to audio paths in the music industry. So it's the exact same thing. If the quickest pathway from the source to transduction and into your signal flow is always with the least amount of pieces in the chain.
Yeah, especially with cameras, the camera and the lenses are designed to work together in very specific ways at very tight tolerances, and having a third-party adapter in the middle that may or may not really comply with those tolerances and those specifications, it has the potential to mess with your final image in a way that I'm not comfortable with. But that's just me personally. As far as the math goes, just looking at, I had to look up speed boosters. That's why I was typing. My bad. The way I understand it with these is they have like Brad said, like a crop factor, but it's not really a crop factor. It instead increases your field of view by a value. So it looks like just this one right here. It's for a Fuji camera, but it's 0.71x. So I would assume that means for a 100 millimeter lens, it's going to adjust the focal length by 0.71. So whatever that value is, 100 times 0.71 is going to be the focal length that you end up with on your final image or video. Which, again, is another reason I don't like adapters, because I bought the lenses that I bought for the focal lengths that they bring to the table. I don't want something in the way that is messing with those focal lengths, making me think that, oh, I'm at 600 millimeters, but I'm really not. Which, again, it may, that, that's probably more important for me just as a still photographer and less of a videographer. But it goes back to what I think we all kind of touched on at the beginning. You just kind of have to evaluate the trade-offs in what you're getting and whether you're willing to make those trade-offs or not. And I kind of, I think, briefly said this to Dimitar. There's no right or wrong way to do for your photography setup. If it works for you, it works for you. If you're happy with the output that you're getting, then that's what really matters in the end. Like I said, these are my personal preferences regarding adapters. So, just like Dimitar, if he wants to shoot at 24 frames per second, shoot at 24 frames per second. If that's what works for you, that's what works for you. So, that's that.
Very well
Adapters.
said.
Okay, very cool. My next question is for the two of you, whoever wants to jump on it. My question is as follows. I know in Dimitar's case and in my case, we have both at times needed to resort to using our cell phones as additional cameras for a project that we're working on, whatever. Something that has to be captured in real time, we need multiple angles for, and we just don't have the equipment, so we have to jump to the cameras, the camera phone, the camera on the phone kind of thing, and then hopefully, work that into the video and it all works out in the end. There's been many times where it hasn't. I just did a project recently that inspired me to purchase some new cameras because I shot this secondary and tertiary angles with and one of the angles was an iPhone. It was an iPhone 10, and I had some problems with the footage. So with that said, between the two of you guys, what are some drawbacks about using phone cameras? And when using a phone camera, is there some tips or tricks that you can possibly share with us to get the most out of it? So what's the pros, what's the cons? You let us know.
I'll go first. So from a technical perspective, the biggest issue with a phone camera is the size of the sensor. I kind of touched on this earlier, but the bigger the sensor for a given number of megapixels, the bigger the actual pixels that make up the sensor can be, which makes them more sensitive to light. The sensor in a phone is one of the smallest sensors that's currently manufactured. They are tiny. They're maybe a little smaller than your pinky nail. Whereas sensor in my camera, same size as a piece of film, 36 by 24 millimeters. So you can see the huge difference in size there. So that means that in a given lighting environment, that small sensor is going to need higher sensitivity, which means it's going to need either a larger aperture or a slower shutter. On phones, those two things, the aperture is usually fixed, and the shutter is not a real shutter. It's an electronic shutter, which is implemented a lot differently than a traditional shutter in an actual camera. So the only thing that can really be changed is the sensitivity. And that's why you see when you take a phone outside at night, your image is filled with grain because the phone is trying to increase the sensitivity as high as it can to get a usable exposure, and it comes out looking poor. So that's the biggest con in using a phone. The second is phones don't usually give you a bunch of settings to play with. So on a camera, especially a higher end camera, they're going to be covered with buttons. There's going to be a ton of menu options that both allow you to change a ton of settings and allow you to change those settings quickly. So like on a phone, like on my iPhone, there is no way just in the regular camera app to adjust the white balance. I can change the exposure and I can tell it where to focus, but that's it. I don't use an Android, so I don't have any familiarity with those, but I'm assuming they're probably very similar. So that's another con. You lose access to all those settings to really make the shot that you want to take. My suggestion, if you are using a phone, and there are professional photographers that take pictures purely with cell phones, but I'm sure that they do this, and this is also my suggestion, download a third-party app that exposes all those controls for you. There's some good ones I know there's some good ones in the Apple App Store. I haven't used them in a while because, of course, I have my camera stuff, so I can't think of the names off the top of my head. But they give you access back to shutter speed, aperture, sensitivity, white balance, all those things that you need to really be successful when you're taking pictures or filming video.
Yeah, for all you guys at home, the apps that Vincent's referring to, there's like hundreds of them. You'll have no issue if you just type something along those lines in the App Store, I'm sure.